Time for that top business news then on the programme. We're starting with a troubling new report on widening economic inequalities in the wake of Covid-19 pandemic. And Brian Quinn is here to tell us about it. Brian.
Well, Stuart, since the pandemic hit, analysts have been projecting different possible outcomes for an eventual recovery. A British anti-poverty NGO Oxfam has a new study out Monday titled The Inequality Virus. Its findings point strongly to what's been called the K-shaped scenario. That's a robust recovery for the upper tiers of the economy with consistent worsening for those on the bottom. Since the pandemic took hold last February, the world's top 1,000 billionaires have seen their fortunes quickly recover to nearly 100% of their previous values in just 9 months. The world's poorest, however, are likely to require 10 years to bounce back from the damage. Meanwhile, the world's 10 richest men have seen their fortunes grow by over $500 billion during the pandemic, a figure that's more than enough to cover vaccinating the world as well as prevent anyone falling into poverty due to the virus. Well, for more on the report, we can bring in Oxfam's Quentin Parrinello, who joins us live. Quentin, one of the more troubling aspects of this report is that it's not just a matter of rich versus poor. Certain groups have been hit especially hard by the crisis. Can you tell us what your research found there?
Right, it's not only a matter of rich and poor, and one of the main takeaways of the report is that the pandemic is also an inequality virus, and it doesn't hit everyone equally. And in many countries, women and minorities are the most impacted by the virus. To give you a couple of examples, in the US in 2020, African-American people were more likely to die from COVID than white people, with a mortality rate that was 50% higher. And we had a very similar situation in Brazil with people of African descent. And women are also in proportion more likely to lose their jobs than men because of the virus, because they're overrepresented in sectors that are the most affected by the crisis. So the message we want to bring in with this report is that if we want to cope with this crisis correctly, we need to take into account all the dimensions of inequality and poverty.
Yeah, I seem to recall the last U.S. jobs report monthly showed that 100% of the jobs lost were among females, actually, which is really a shocking statistic. Well, now, France, of course, has not been spared the effects of this growing inequality. What did you find with regards to the situation here in this country?
Yes, in France as well, the virus has been a catalyst for inequality. Billionaires in France ended up 2020 richer than when they started in January. Their wealth grew by 175 billion euros since March. That's twice the equivalent of the budget for public hospitals in France. And at the same time, we're seeing a massive hike in the equivalent of food stamps in France. 8 million people requiring the equivalent of food stamps. They were 5.5 million before the crisis. And the message we want to convey with this report is that this is the result of political choices in the recovery. And we stress that there is sort of a double standard in the whatever it takes approach to this crisis, because governments injected hundreds of billions of dollars in financial markets, in bailing out big business and big corporations, and there's nothing comparing with the money on the table for the most vulnerable, precarious workers, women in particular, and the unemployed. And just to stress that this is a matter of political will, because France set up a pretty decent job protection scheme, called chômage partiel that works very well for people on full-time jobs, but it doesn't work as well for the more vulnerable people. So we need to go a step further and make sure that the most vulnerable are protected during this crisis.
Well, speaking of political choices and those made here in France, what are some of the policy prescriptions that you recommend to mitigate some of this growing inequality?
I think the silver lining is that we must not make the same mistakes that we did after the last financial crisis, because the political choices that we made and austerity measures that we pushed over the last decade, they hampered our ability to respond, to cope with the current pandemic. And it's time for government to rebuild an economy that works for the many and not for the few. That means reinvesting in essential services such as health and education. That means making sure that people are paid a living wage and expanding safety nets and social protections. And that means also making sure that the wealthiest of our society pay their fair share of taxes. And in some countries, we're seeing some countries taking steps to address this. For instance, Argentina and Bolivia just voted extraordinary wealth taxes to make sure that the richest pay for the corona bill. And we're seeing similar discussions in Spain and in the UK. So there's something to watch over the next month.
All right, some potential examples to follow there, some potential signs of hope, I suppose, Stuart, as we try to deal with this growing crisis.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Quentin. Can bet hope. Let's have a quick check on the day's trading action then. How are the markets shaping up so far today, Brian?
Well, Stuart, European indexes opened in positive territory Monday as investors look to the possibility of bigger, faster economic stimulus program in the U.S. We see London, Paris, and Frankfurt all up just under 0.5% there. Asian indexes also gaining ground. Hong Kong rose over 2% as a new UN report shows China surpassing the U.S. as the #1 destination for foreign investment last year. Kospi and Seoul also up over 2% at the close. Keeping an eye on those markets today.
Brian, thank you very much. Brian Quinn with Business of France 24. Thanks very much.